Hercule Poirot and the Secret in the Silver Spoon. Chapter 1. The Interrupted Dinner. The rain pounded against the dining room's large windows like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. In the majestic Varnier mansion on the outskirts of Lyon, the chandeliers shone with a warm glow, reflecting off the carefully polished silverware. It was the annual charity dinner, hosted by Madame Geneviève Varnier, widow of the famous sugar industrialist Armand Varnier. The evening was filled with polite conversation, discreet toasts and knives slicing sirloin with aristocratic precision. At the head of the table, Madame Varnier was raising her glass of champagne when the butler, Jacques, burst into the room with a face as white as the tablecloth. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," he said in a trembling voice. "Something's happened in the blue drawing-room." The room fell silent. Madame Varnier slowly sat up. "What happened, Jacques?" The man swallowed. "Monsieur Félix has been found dead. He's on the floor next to the sideboard, and there's blood." A stifled gasp came from Mademoiselle Aline, the hostess's young niece. Dr. Renard, present at the dinner, immediately stood up and headed to the blue salon with Jacques, followed by several of the guests. Madame Varnier, without losing her composure, stood her ground as her gaze shifted to the empty chair to her right, that of Félix Dumaine, her trusted administrator for over a decade. Minutes later, the doctor returned with a serious face. There's no doubt," he said quietly. "He was murdered, with a hard blow to the base of the skull, with a blunt object, maybe something from the crockery itself. The place is in disarray, as if there'd been a struggle or a search." A murmur of confusion ran through the room. Madame Varnier firmly requested that no one leave the house. The police were immediately notified, but before the gendarmes arrived, a man was already on his way. The next day, a dark grey car pulled up in front of the mansion's wrought-iron gate. A small, impeccably dressed man with a finely trimmed moustache and a cane, he used more for style than necessity, stepped out. "Mademoiselle Fournier," he said softly, showing his card to the guard at the entrance. "I am Hercule Poirot. I was invited by Madame Varnier to attend dinner last night, although, it seems, I arrived a little late." The guard allowed him to pass, visibly impressed. Poirot crossed the garden, still damp from the storm, and presented himself to the hostess, who was waiting for him in the main hall with an expression of controlled concern. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming. I know it's unusual to request your services before the police have completed their report, but this is no ordinary crime. Félix had no enemies. He had no vices. He lived for order and numbers. Something doesn't add up." Poirot nodded politely. "Madam, when appearances are too clean, that's when you have to look beneath the surface. May I see the crime scene?" He led her to the blue room. The place had been cordoned off by the local police, but Madame Varnier obtained special permission for the Belgian detective to discreetly inspect it. Poirot walked slowly, hands clasped, touching nothing. He looked at the body, still lying there, waiting for the coroner. Then he stopped in front of the sideboard, where one of the silver spoons had fallen to the floor, its handle bent. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A spoon dropped in the middle of a violent crime, and even more so, a spoon that doesn't look like it's been used for dinner." His gaze hardened for a moment. Then he turned to Madame Varnier. "Could you tell me, madame, if any of the cutlery was removed or replaced after dinner?" She frowned. "Not that I know of, but I can check with Jacques." Poirot smiled. "Please. And in the meantime, I'd like to see the complete guest list, as well as the assigned seats. You know, so I can start putting my little grey area to work." Hercule Poirot's investigation had begun, and at the centre of it all, a silver spoon which wasn't where it should be. Chapter 2. Shadows on the Table. Jacques, the butler, was a stony-faced man, dressed in a black uniform that contrasted with his silent gait. When Madame Varnier summoned him to the library, where Poirot was standing by the window, he entered with a slight nod, showing no emotion, as if the crime committed at the mansion hadn't disturbed his routine. "Monsieur Jacques," said Poirot in a friendly tone, "I would like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." "I am at your disposal, sir." Poirot settled into the velvet armchair, his eyes never leaving the man. "Did you supervise the table setting during dinner?" "Oui, sir. Every piece of cutlery, every glass, and every napkin were placed in Madame Varnier's usual order. The silverware was polished that same day. Did you notice any irregularities? Any missing or misplaced utensils?" Jacques hesitated for only a second. "No, monsieur, except that Madame requested that the antique set of dessert spoons be used, the ones that belonged to the late Monsieur Varnier." "Why this change?" "It was a last-minute whim. She said she wanted to pay tribute to her husband with that gesture." Poirot nodded slowly, stroking his moustache. "And after dinner, did anyone touch the dishes? Was it removed?" "No, sir. As you know, the crime was discovered shortly after finishing the second course. Dessert had barely been served." Poirot stood up and walked to the central table in the library, where the plans of the Aide-en-Or mansion were laid out. He pointed. "Could you please tell me where the sideboard is, where Monsieur Felix's body was found?" Jacques bent over the map. "Here, sir, opposite the window in the blue drawing-room, just below the oval mirror. And that sideboard, did it contain anything valuable?" "Just decorative objects, sir. Some porcelain figurines, crystal glasses, and some antique service." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Did it include any of those silver spoons?" "I couldn't say. That game is usually kept in the dining-room glass cabinet. It shouldn't have been there." Poirot dismissed the butler with a slight bow, and remained thoughtful. Madame Varnier entered a few moments later, carrying with her the guest list and a plan of the dining-room, on which each name was carefully noted. "Here it is, Monsieur Poirot." The detective greeted her with a smile. "Thank you, madam. These kinds of details are essential." He carefully reviewed the names: Dr. Renard, Miss Aline Fournier, Colonel Dupin, the young violinist Paul Marceau, the Varniers' distant cousin, Madame Lisette Delrieux, and a woman named Clémence Latour, described as a friend of the family. Poirot pursed his lips. "Who was the last to see Monsieur Félix alive?" "I think it was Clémence," Madame Varnier replied thoughtfully. "She got up before dessert, saying she needed some air. Félix excused himself shortly afterward and also left. We assumed it was to check some of the accounts. He always carried his black notebook with him." "And that notebook, it wasn't in his body, nor in the library." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Curious, isn't it? a methodical man who was never far from his notebook disappears. And soon after, he's murdered. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Miss Aline, her eyes red. "Forgive me for interrupting, but there is something you should perhaps know, Monsieur Poirot." "Please, mademoiselle." She moved forward timidly. "Last night before dinner, I heard Felix arguing with Lisette on the veranda. I didn't understand much, but she spoke to him in a very low voice, almost as if pleading. And he said something like, 'It's not my fault if someone already knows.'" Poirot inclined his head slightly. "And you didn't mention it to the police?" "I thought it wasn't important. Until now." Poirot thanked her for the information and waited for Aline to leave. "Madame Varnier, did Lisette and Felix have any prior relationship?" The woman hesitated. "Lisette spent a few seasons here years ago. She was a friend of my late husband, and Felix, well, he was very reserved, but he was always loyal." Poirot walked slowly towards the window. "A crime isn't committed by chance in a house like this. It's the result of tensions, secrets, and objects as seemingly innocent as a silver spoon." His eyes fell on the rain-drenched garden. "Today, madame, I'll need to interview all the guests, one by one." And so, with the elegance of a dancer and the cunning of a falcon, Hercule Poirot delved deeper into the web of silver-plated lies woven at the Varnier mansion. Chapter 3. Echoes of the past. The following morning brought with it a thick air, as if the Varnier mansion itself were holding its breath. Poirot, already awake before dawn, had had his breakfast on the conservatory terrace, surrounded by geraniums and the distant scent of damp earth. In his black-covered notebook, he had meticulously noted the names, gestures, and contradictions that were beginning to appear like bubbles in an overshaken glass of champagne. The first to be called into the library was Colonel Dupin. With his straight back and grey moustache, his gait revealed a discipline not yet eroded by age. He sat opposite Poirot without greeting him, regarding him suspiciously. "Colonel," Poirot began politely, "what was your relationship with Monsieur Felix?" "I barely knew him. He was a reserved man, not very given to conversation, although I must admit there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't put my finger on it. Where were you when the crime occurred?" "In the smoking room, reading an article about the Egyptian campaign." "I can tell you the exact page. Ask Paul Marceau. He was with me. Although, of course, the guy kept playing that damn invisible violin with his fingers." Poirot took notes without looking up. When the colonel had left, young Paul Marceau entered, slender, nervous, his curls dishevelled, as if he hadn't slept all night. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, sitting down with obvious unease, "I assure you I saw and heard nothing. I was with the colonel almost the whole time. He irritated me a little, to be honest, but I didn't leave." "And what impression did you have of Monsieur Felix?" Paul hesitated. He was correct. Distant. I never knew whether he approved of me or despised me. He didn't understand music. He said it was an unnecessary luxury. But I have no reason to kill him, if that's what he's implying. And after dinner, did you stay in the living room? No. I went up to the conservatory upstairs to smoke. I have anxiety problems, Monsieur Poirot. It helps me breathe." Poirot nodded slowly. He wasn't judging. He was just observing. Next came Clémence Latour, a middle-aged woman with a feline gaze and a deep voice. She wore gloves, even inside the house, which didn't go unnoticed by Poirot. "Where were you, madam, when the body was discovered? On the back terrace?" I excused myself before dessert. The dense atmosphere bothered me. Something was about to explode. "And did you have any previous relationship with the deceased?" Felix and I shared a passion for discretion. We respected each other from afar. "But listen carefully, Monsieur Poirot." Her eyes narrowed. "There are many secrets in this house. Too many." Felix knew it. He was playing with fire. "And you?" "I was only dancing around the fire, not in it." Poirot dismissed her with a slight "Boo!" Then came Madame Lisette Delrieux. She was a woman who had aged with mysterious grace. Her perfume was ancient, and her hands restless. "Madame," Poirot began softly, "I've been told that you were seen talking to Felix before dinner." "What were you discussing?" She swallowed. "A personal matter. Something from the past that resurfaced. It has nothing to do with his death, I swear. May I know what it was about?" "It was about an inheritance," he replied, lowering his voice. "An old will, Armand Varnier's. But that was a mistake, a minor confusion. Felix thought he'd found a document, but it had no legal value, only painful memories." Poirot tilted his head. "And that document? He destroyed it. That's what he told me." But his voice trembled at the very end. Poirot said nothing. At the end of the afternoon, he interviewed the last person, young Aline Fournier. Of all those he'd seen, she seemed the only one genuinely affected by Felix's death. "He taught me accounting in my spare time. He talked numbers the way others talk poetry. He was kind, in that dry way. I don't know who would want to hurt him. And you didn't notice anything strange that night? Just Lisette." She was restless, as if she were afraid of something. "And also, I noticed that the dessert spoon they gave me was different from the others. The engraving was more elaborate." Poirot stopped. "Do you keep it?" "I left it on the table, of course. But now that you mention it, I never saw it picked up." Poirot sat up. A flash of light lit up his eyes. "Mademoiselle, you have been of invaluable help." That night, when the mansion was asleep, Poirot returned alone to the dining room. Lantern in hand, he searched among the drawers of the sideboard. In the narrowest, he found what he was looking for: a silver spoon, slightly curved, and in the handle a small indentation. It wasn't decorative. It was a groove. Poirot took a thin pin from his pocket and inserted it into the slot. A slight click was heard. The top of the handle opened like a capsule, and inside, neatly rolled up, was a piece of yellowish paper. Poirot unrolled it with gloves. "Ah, my dears," he whispered. "The secret wasn't in the words spoken, but in the ones someone tried to hide inside a spoon." And so the spoon ceased to be a simple utensil, and became the key to a carefully buried truth. Chapter 4. The Paper That Shouldn't Have Existed. Poirot delicately tucked the paper he'd found inside the spoon handle into his white linen handkerchief, as if it were an ancient relic that might disintegrate at the slightest sudden movement. He walked silently to the library, where the fireplace still burned softly, casting flickering shadows on the book-lined walls. He sat down with great care, unfolded the paper, and examined it by the light of a desk lamp. It wasn't an ordinary note. The document, though wrinkled and yellowed, was dated 1927 and bore the unmistakable handwriting of Armand Varnier. There was no doubt. It was a fragment of a will prior to the one officially registered after his death. It mentioned a substantial modification, a clause that spoke of a reserved legacy for an illegitimate daughter, named only by initials. Hercule Poirot frowned. Clémence Latour. The revelation took him by surprise, but it didn't satisfy him. Too obvious, too easy, and above all, too risky for Clémence to hide a document that implicated her so directly. Inside a spoon in the house where her supposed enemy lived. No, that wasn't how the killer operated. Poirot knew that the most perfect crimes were disguised as obvious mistakes. At dawn, Monsieur Delorme, a methodical old man with a collection of framed stamps, appeared at the office of the local notary. Poirot showed him the paper. The man examined it with a magnifying glass, narrowed his eyes and murmured, This was never recorded in our archives, but it's authentic. The signature is definitely Armand's. Could it have been intentionally destroyed? If it was, someone made a grave mistake, because this document, although incomplete, substantially modifies the distribution of the fortune. If its validity were confirmed, Madame Varnier would have had to recognize the beneficiary, or risk a public legal battle. Poirot returned to the mansion with the parchment hidden under his coat. He entered unnoticed and asked to speak privately with Madame Varnier. He found her sitting at her desk, reviewing papers with an untouched cup of tea beside her. "Madam," he began, "I need you to look at this document carefully. Do you recognize it?" She took the paper, read it slowly, and her eyes widened with a flash of disbelief, then fear. This was destroyed. Armand showed it to me years ago when he thought he was dying. He begged me to make it disappear, and I did. I burned it. Was it complete? No. It was missing the second page. I never knew who that CL was, and she swore she'd never sign it before a notary. But this document has her signature. Poirot stared at her. And who else knew of its existence? Only 3 people that I know of. My husband Felix, who insisted on keeping a copy in case anyone accused him of hiding things, and Lisette. Poirot put the document away again. What had once been a tangle of possibilities was beginning to take on a clear structure. With each step, the suspects ceased to be shadows and emerged like pieces of a puzzle. That same evening, he asked Jacques to organize another dinner party. Same setting, same menu, same dishes. Do you wish to repeat the night of the crime, Monsieur Poirot? Not the crime, Jacques, the lie. The dining room was prepared with ritualistic care. Every glass, every plate, every teaspoon. Poirot walked slowly around the table, like an orchestra conductor tuning his baton. When everyone was seated, Poirot took the same spot Felix had occupied on the night of the crime. No one spoke. The silence was tense, expectant. Then Poirot raised a teaspoon with a theatrical gesture. "Did you know," he said in his soft but firm voice, "that this spoon contains a secret compartment?" Everyone looked at him. Some were surprised, others paralyzed. Within it lay proof of a forgotten legacy, a truth someone tried to hide, and for which Felix Dumaine lost his life. A faint gasp escaped Lisette's lips. Clémence narrowed. Her eyes. Paul Marceau, pale, dropped his napkin. Poirot stood up. Now I know almost everything. But to fully understand this enigma, I still have to make one more visit. One last piece is missing from the board. And with that, he left. As he walked toward his room, he whispered to himself. Or was it a false clue to divert attention from the wrong initial? The spoon had spoken. But its story wasn't complete yet. Shall we continue with the Chapter 5? Chapter 5. The Invisible Heiress. The next morning, Poirot left the Varnier mansion early, accompanied only by his cane and leather diary. His destination? The St. Joseph orphanage on the outskirts of Lyon, a place forgotten by time, where the corridors smelled of old chalk and disinfectant. He had been directed there by a discreet note found on the back of the mysterious document, a handwritten address in faded ink, followed by a date. April 1928. An elderly sister greeted him politely, though with surprise. I'm seeking information about a child registered here in the spring of 1928, Poirot explained in his gentlest tone. A child who, I suspect, was registered under the initials CL. The sister looked at him suspiciously, but seeing his card and noticing his respectful tone, she nodded and led him to a dusty room full of filing cabinets. Several minutes passed before they found the file. The full name was Claire Le Marchand-Born, to an unknown mother. Father unregistered, given to the orphanage anonymously by a well-dressed woman who signed her last name Durand, without presenting any documentation. Poirot flipped through the notes. Claire had been adopted in 1934 by a family from the interior of the country, the Fournier. Fournier, Poirot murmured. Like Aline Fournier. The nun nodded. Poirot stood very still, his eyes half closed, his moustache slightly trembling with the strain of thought. Then he stood up resolutely. "Thank you, sister. You've been a great help." When he returned to the mansion, he asked to see Aline. He found her sitting on the glass-enclosed veranda, reading a book without really paying attention. She closed the book as she saw him approaching, her expression anxious. "Have you discovered anything else, Monsieur Poirot?" "Maybe so, and maybe not," he replied with an ambiguous smile. "But first, I need to understand something. Was your mother adopted?" Aline tensed. "Yes, they never hid that from me. My mother, Claire, was adopted by my grandparents when she was a child. She died years ago. Did she know anything about her origins? No. She just said she was born in Lyon, but that she had no interest in looking for those who didn't want her." Poirot nodded, very slowly. "And you never wanted to investigate further?" "Honestly, sir, no. My mother was extraordinary. What came before didn't matter to me." Poirot was silent for a moment. "Could you show me a picture of her?" Aline led him into a small living room where she took out an album. Poirot took out an old black-and-white photograph. In it, Claire appeared with her dark hair pulled back, her eyes intense and her smile sober. Poirot needed nothing more. Her features were unmistakable. The resemblance to Armand Varnier was subtle but undeniable. That evening, Poirot again gathered Madame Varnier, Lisette, Clémence, and Aline in the library. Standing by the fireplace, he maintained the composure of a judge before delivering his verdict. Mesdames, allow me to introduce you to the most important person in this story. He said, gently pointing at Aline, Miss Aline Fournier, or if fate had been more just, the legitimate heir of Armand Varnier. Aline froze. Lisette brought a hand to her mouth. Clémence lowered her gaze. Madame Varnier closed her eyes, as if something inevitable had just materialized. Poirot, continued Claire Le Marchand, her mother, was Armand's illegitimate daughter. The document Felix hid in the silver spoon, the same one they thought was destroyed, left part of the inheritance to her. But that document had to disappear, and someone, mesdames, was willing to kill to make sure it did. Lisette broke the silence with a tense voice. Are you saying that one of us killed Felix for that reason? I'm not saying it yet, said Poirot. But I do know this. Felix had found the will. He planned to show it to the authorities. He wanted to do the right thing, even if it cost him his position. But he made a fatal mistake. He told the wrong person, someone with too much to lose if the truth came out. And who? Madame Varnier asked, her voice harsh. Ah, madame, that's the question I'll answer very soon. I just have to confirm one more detail. A very small one. Poirot took a step towards the door, then turned with a serious expression. But remember this. The killer thought the truth was buried with Felix. What he didn't know is that sometimes a spoon can hold more than just dessert. And without saying anything else, he left, leaving behind him a silence as thick as fog. Chapter 6. A true lady doesn't dirty her hands. The walls of the Varnier mansion remained expectantly, silent, as if the building itself sensed the approaching outcome. Poirot, always meticulous, had spent the last few hours reviewing small details, mismatched schedules, poorly concealed expressions, the arrangement of cutlery at dinner, and above all, the lies wrapped in elegant words. That evening she asked Jacques for unsweetened tea. It was served in the music room, where Paul Marceau's scores were still open on the piano, as if someone had been interrupted mid-melody. Poirot looked at the teapot, turned his cup around, and with a napkin wiped away a speck of dust that no one else would have noticed. The killer made only one mistake, he murmured. A tiny one, but a fatal one. At that moment, Madame Varnier appeared, still composed but with a paler face than usual. Monsieur Poirot, do you know who did it? He nodded slowly. Yes, madame, but I need to confirm this with everyone present. The truth, when revealed, must be revealed to everyone who witnessed the lie. That same evening, Poirot gathered everyone once more in the blue drawing-room, the same one where Félix Dumaine's body had been found. The atmosphere was dense. The chairs formed a semicircle in front of the fireplace. The atmosphere was reminiscent of a courtroom, and Poirot, with his methodical gait, assumed the role of judge without ostentation. My lords and ladies, he began, I thank you for your patience. Now, the moment of truth has arrived. He stopped beside a small pedestal where the silver spoon rested, carefully wrapped. This seemingly innocent piece contained a forgotten will, a document revealing the existence of an illegitimate daughter of Armand Varnier. That daughter was Claire Le Marchand, and his daughter is our beloved Mademoiselle Aline Fournier. A slight murmur ran through the room. Poirot continued. Félix Dumaine discovered the document. He planned to make it public. But before he could, he was murdered, hit on the head with a blunt object, probably a desk weight, and then staged to look like the victim of a burglary. He approached Clémence Latour. You, madame, had a powerful reason to hide the truth. If Aline were recognized as heir, your place in the family, as a trusted friend, as Madame Varnier's confidante, would be diminished. But it wasn't you who committed the crime. Clémence raised an eyebrow, but did not speak. Poirot then turned to Lisette Delrieux. Madame Lisette, you were the only one who admitted to arguing with Félix. And you mentioned an old will, although I had no way of knowing about it, unless you already knew about it. Lisette shifted in her seat. What are you implying? That you lied? That you knew about Claire Lemarchand's existence? In fact, you were the one who handed her over to the orphanage under the surname Durand, which, as I discovered, you used for a short time when you lived in Paris after a family scandal. An icy silence fell over the room. She was your daughter, wasn't she? Said Poirot in a low voice. Lisette lowered her head. Yes, but Armand didn't recognize her. And when Félix found the document, I was afraid that everything would come out. I couldn't allow it. Not for me, but for her. Poirot made a slight gesture. No, madame, you were protecting your pride. But you weren't the one who killed Félix either. You cried that night. I saw it in your eyes. The fear. It wasn't that of a murderer, but that of an exposed mother. Lisette burst into tears. Clémence put her arm around her Poirot, then turned to Madame Varnier. Madame, you said you destroyed the will, but you knew Félix kept a copy, and when he decided to reveal it, he became a direct threat to you, not for the money, but for the legacy. Madame Varnier remained unfazed. She remained erect. Go on, Mr. Poirot. You didn't hit Félix, but you knew who would. You convinced Jacques, the butler, to get rid of the document. You told him that if Félix spoke, you would lose everything your husband built. And Jacques, loyal as an old dog, obeyed. Poirot turned towards the door. Jacques, he called. The butler, who until then had remained hidden in the shadows, entered. His gaze was blank. His hands were trembling. It's true, he said, without looking up. I didn't mean to kill him, just confront him. But he resisted. He pushed me, and I reacted. It was a blow, just one. I didn't think he'd die. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. And then he hid the document where he thought no one would look for it. In the crockery. In the antique spoon, which he knew would never be used again. A long silence fell. No one knew what to say. Madame, Varnier finally stood up. Thank you, Jacques, he said in a deep voice. As always, you did what was necessary. But this time there was no pride in his tone. Poirot headed for the door. Justice will take care of it now. Me and my friends. I have no more questions. And with his cane in hand, the Belgian detective left the room, leaving behind the echo of a truth too bitter to be celebrated. Chapter 7. Under oath of silence, the next morning, the Varnier mansion was plunged into a false calm, as if time had decided to freeze, waiting for the echo of the crime to dissipate. But nothing ever completely dissipated, Poirot thought as he ate his breakfast by the library window. Through the steamed glass, He looked out onto the garden where Jacques used to supervise the pruning of the rose bushes. Now, the butler was in the custody of the local gendarmerie, in a temporary holding cell in the district. But Poirot wasn't satisfied. Something wasn't right. The crime scene, the position of the body, the frozen expression of panic on Felix's face. It wasn't the expression of someone dying at the hands of a loyal servant. It was a reaction of shock, yes, but also of betrayal. There was something more. Poirot stood up and walked to the desk. He picked up his notebook. The words he had written days before guided him again. Felix was afraid, not of the contents of the will, but of who would know he had it. And then it happened. A mental image, dinner, the change of cutlery, Aline's comment about the different spoon. The fact that Jacques shouldn't have had access to the special tableware without direct instructions. What if... Poirot asked to see Madame Varnier once more. He found her on the upper gallery, reading a closed book. "Madame," he said calmly, "I came to say goodbye. The police have taken control of the case." Jacques confessed. "You can go on with your life." She slowly closed the book. "And you really believe that, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, not entirely." She stared at him, not as a surprised woman, but as a woman who had finally been seen. "So, why doesn't he say anything?" "Because this story isn't just about the law. It's about something more delicate. The human soul." Poirot approached her. "You didn't wield the weapon, but you provoked him, precisely. I knew Jacques wouldn't resist the moral dilemma if I presented it as an act of loyalty, Madame." Varnier did not deny anything. "Do you know what that would have meant if it were revealed? My husband's reputation destroyed, my position dishonoured, my family's legacy revoked by a daughter he never acknowledged, and all because of a piece of paper hidden in a spoon." "A spoon," Poirot repeated softly. "Yes, but not just any spoon. The only one from the old set that had never been used. The one Armand kept as a souvenir. A symbol." She nodded with dignity. "And yet it was used. To protect the truth. And you," said Poirot after a pause, "ordered Jacques to retrieve that paper. And in your fear, in your clumsiness, you killed." "I didn't order him to kill anyone. But he knew it could happen, and he chose silence." Madame Varnier stood up with slow but firm steps. "And now, are you going to hand me over?" Poirot thought, for a moment. His reply was as delicate as a whisper. "No!" She looked at him, surprised for the first time. "No? Oh, the law already has Jacques. And justice, well, madame, justice isn't always found in the courts. Sometimes it hides in one's conscience. And you will live with the certainty that your silence destroyed a faithful man. That punishment will be more constant than any sentence." He bowed slightly. "I beg you to take care of Aline. She shouldn't bear the burden of this story. She's innocent, and she will be if you allow it." Madame Varnier didn't respond. She merely nodded slowly, as if that single movement weighed more heavily on her than the title of widow, heiress, or socialite. Hours later, Poirot said goodbye to Aline with sincere warmth. She offered him a faint smile, grateful but broken. Then he got into the car that would take him to Lyon. As the car rolled along the gravel road, Poirot leaned back gently in his seat. His thoughts were calm but sharp. In this case, he murmured, the truth was served with dessert, but the bitterness, that came later. And the great Hercule Poirot, his little grey cell satisfied, closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to remember, because after all, memory was the only mirror in which the guilty could not lie to themselves. Chapter 8. The Unwritten Words. Although Poirot had already left the Varnier mansion, the case still left its lingering scent within the walls. Madame Varnier, silent as a portrait that has seen too much, paced through the blue drawing-room, now stripped of its aura of elegance. It was no longer a place for meetings, music, or toasts. It was, quite simply, a place where a truth too heavy for some and too late for others had been revealed. In a corner of the room, Aline had sat down, slowly flipping through the family album Lisette had given her that morning. The photographs were old, many in sepia, with worn edges. In one, Claire Le Marchand, her mother, was standing next to a wrought-iron gate, with a look on her face that now, for the first time, Aline fully understood. There was resignation, yes, but also pride. Aline looked up when she heard footsteps. It was Lisette, her face more serene than it had been in the previous days, though still marked by years of buried secrets. "Can I sit with you?" Aline nodded. The two women shared a long silence, not awkward, but necessary. "I don't know what to tell you," Lisette finally murmured. "Maybe there's no need to say anything, just let the past speak. Your mother was the best thing that ever happened to me. But she was also the greatest burden of my life. I could never talk about her, not even when she died. And why didn't you tell me when I grew up? Because you'd already suffered enough with her absence. And I was afraid that by telling the truth, you'd lose her dignity too. I wanted you to remember her as a mother, not as a secret." Aline closed the album. Poirot knew everything, but he didn't name you as the culprit. "Because I'm not," Lisette replied firmly. "I didn't kill Felix, but I did pressure him. I begged him not to reveal anything, to wait. Maybe I accidentally pushed him over the edge. And that haunts me every day." A long moment passed before Aline took his hand. "You weren't the only one." Everyone here chose silence. Meanwhile, in Lyon, Poirot had settled into a small room at the Hôtel Métropole. Not out of necessity. His fame would have guaranteed him more luxurious accommodations, but out of preference. There, between modest walls and dim lighting, his thoughts had space to organize themselves with the precision he demanded. On the small table, next to his pocket-comb and his small bottle of lavender essence, lay an unopened letter. It was from Jacques, written before his arrest, delivered by an officer who had received direct instructions from Poirot himself. He opened it carefully. "Mr. Poirot, I know you already know the truth. I know that, in your implacable logic, you have deduced what I myself can barely understand. I loved Madame Varnier, not in a vulgar or romantic way. I loved her like a dog loves its master, with blind loyalty. When he asked me to retrieve the document, I did so without question. But he didn't ask me to kill him. That was my mistake. He challenged me. He told me no one could stop the truth, and I felt cornered. If you hate me, I understand. But if you can, Tell Aline. Her mother would have been proud of her." Jacques Poirot read the letter twice. Then he folded it neatly and put it in his notebook. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Days later, in the small village church, a discreet memorial service was held for Félix Dumaine. There was no official speech, no grandiloquent eulogy, just simple words from the local priest and a final sentence written by Aline on a small card on the grave. "You were right when no one wanted to be. Poirot didn't attend, but he sent a white lily. No signature, no note, because for him true justice didn't require applause, only silence and memory." Chapter 9. The Missing Portrait. Days after the funeral, the Varnier mansion remained enveloped in a state of melancholic pause. The servants moved with subdued steps, avoiding the rooms where the memory of Félix still hung in the air. The candles in the main hall had not been relit, and dinners were now brief, without conversation, as if every word carried too high a price. In the upper gallery, next to the piano, Aline peered at the family portraits hanging on the wall. There were Madame Varnier in her youth, Armand in his imposing industrial pose, and even an oil painting of Lisette when she was barely 20. But there was an empty space on the far right. The frame was still there, but the canvas had been removed. What was there? He asked aloud, to no one in particular. The answer came from Clémence, who had just entered with a tray of undelivered letters. A portrait of Claire, painted in secret by Armand. He had it done when she was 18, but when he learned she was pregnant, he removed it from view. He said he couldn't afford such weaknesses in the family legacy. Aline turned to her, frowning. "And no one thought to tell me this?" Clémence sighed. "It wasn't our secret to share. It was one of the many ghosts this house decided to lock away. Where is he now? In the attic, probably, with the paintings not on display and the memorabilia that was deemed uncomfortable." Aline didn't respond. She just walked out in silence. The attic was dusty and smelled of aged wood. Aline climbed the narrow steps, flashlight in hand. The windows had been closed for years, and every corner seemed to be protected from light. In one corner, covered with a blanket, she found a rectangular figure leaning against the wall. Carefully, he removed the cloth. Claire's portrait emerged from the shadow. It was a masterful piece. The young woman was seated on a garden bench, dressed in a sober blue suit, her hands in her lap, her eyes dark and deep. There was serenity in her expression, but also a hidden pain, a gesture Aline knew well, because she had seen it reflected in the mirror many times. Emotion rose in her chest like a slow, bitter wave. She didn't cry. She couldn't. It was a feeling thicker than crying. Poirot, if he had been there, would have said, "There you have it, Mademoiselle, there is the last witness to the crime." A witness without a voice, but with a gaze. Aline brought the portrait down herself. She cleaned it. She carried it to the main hall and placed it where it belonged, in the empty space under the central chandelier. When Madame Varnier came down the stairs and saw it, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you know it existed?" Aline asked. The old woman nodded slowly. "Yes, but I never wanted him here." "I'm not surprised," Aline replied without rancour, but with the clarity that truth brings. Madame Varnier walked up to the portrait and gazed at it for several long seconds. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible gesture, she placed a finger on the frame, as if touching the hand of a shadow. "Armand wasn't cruel by nature," she said, "but he had an unwavering sense of duty, and he was unforgiving when life strayed from his plan. Your mother, she was the only crack in his perfect logic." "Then she was human," Aline whispered, "and that's enough for me." That evening, at the Hôtel Métropole, Poirot wrote a letter. Not to the police, nor to any newspaper. It was for himself, like one of those private meditations that only a meticulous man could justify. The Silver Spoon murder wasn't just a murder. It was the eruption of a legacy that refused to evolve. Felix died for revealing a truth that should have been told 20 years earlier. Jacques killed not out of hatred, but out of blind loyalty. Madame Varnier didn't break the law, but she did break trust, and Aline, without asking, inherited a history full of silences. "I've solved many crimes, but few as profoundly human as this one." He signed his signature with his usual signature and closed the notebook. Then he poured himself a glass of anise liqueur, looked out the window at the distant lights of Lyon, and allowed himself, for once, to feel something more than professional satisfaction. Melancholy was allowed, because the crime was already solved, but the wounds were just beginning to heal. Chapter 10. Justice Without Judgment. Spring was creeping into Lyon with the first buds on the magnolia trees in the Haguedoux municipal garden. It was the season of rebirth, but at the Varnier mansion, all blossoming felt false, as if the place needed even more winter to purge itself. The echoes of Félix Dumaine's murder were still present, although the outside world was beginning to forget it, displaced by new headlines and scandals of a different kind. Inside, Madame Varnier had withdrawn almost completely. She received few visitors, spoke even less. Her haughty, polished figure, which had presided over dinners and presidiums, was now that of a shadowy statue. But she didn't collapse. She wasn't that type. Instead, she began to sort through her papers. Aline found her several times burning documents in the fireplace, some bearing Armand's old seals, others bearing lawyers' letterheads. "Are you cleaning up the past?" she asked one morning. "No," Madame Varnier replied. "I'm reducing your power." Aline did not insist. Meanwhile, Poirot, back in Brussels, received an unexpected letter. It came from the office of the Notary Delorme. It was brief. "Mr. Poirot, following your instructions, I've reviewed the additional file on Armand Varnier that you pointed out. As I suspected, the final will, the one on file, included a handwritten clause in the margin. It's not official. It's not signed, but in it, Armand mentions my daughter Claire, whom I don't talk about in public, but whom I cannot ignore in my conscience. The will was registered without this page. It was deliberately omitted. Should it be made public? It's your decision." Delorme, Notary Poirot read the letter several times. Then he placed it on the mantelpiece and went out for a walk. Justice, he thought, isn't always written in codes or signed in black ink. Sometimes it's written in the hearts of those who must bear the burden of not having exercised it in time. At the mansion, Aline decided to leave, not to escape, but to free herself. She said she wanted to explore the city where her mother had grown up, to see the places she'd once set foot in, to search for traces of her, if anything still remained, in the borders of photographs and other people's stories. "Will you come back?" Lisette asked, helping her close her suitcase. "Maybe, but not here. Sometimes you have to let a house die so the truth can live elsewhere." Before leaving, Aline left an envelope in the library. There was no name written on the outside. It contained only a copy of Claire's portrait and a short note. "For those who dare to look directly at what others have hidden. History doesn't need revenge, only memory." A week later, Poirot received a package wrapped in cream-coloured paper. No return address. Inside, a copy of Claire's portrait and a silver spoon, the same one. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. The truth, at last, was in its place. In his Brussels apartment, Poirot placed the teaspoon in his personal display case. Not as a trophy, but as a testament. On a label, he wrote in his neat handwriting, "The case of the spoon that talked more than its owners." And below, "The truth, served with elegance, even when crime tried to hide it." Then she poured herself a cup of hot chocolate, sat by the window, and with her fingers crossed over her stomach, closed her eyes. Because the mystery was over, but the deduction, that one never slept. Chapter 11. Grey cells never rest. The silver spoon case was officially closed. Not by a court ruling, there was no trial, but by a series of carefully planned silences. Jacques accepted his guilt, and the authorities, satisfied with the confession, did not dig any deeper. The case was filed under the title Circumstantial Homicide in Defence of Property. But for Poirot, this was, as always, a simplified version of a deeper truth. In his apartment on Rue des Capucines, the Belgian detective reviewed his casebook, one he never shared with the press or the courts. It was a private archive of motivations, human contradictions, and errors of judgment, a compendium of criminal psychology, without names, without dates, just behaviours. He opened a new page. He wrote in blue ink, "Case, the silver spoon lesson. Crime isn't always born of hate. Sometimes it sprouts from the need to preserve a lie." Mastermind, Madame Vanier executing hand, Jacques Réal victim, the truth, unexpected heiress, Aline invisible witness. Claire, he put down his pen, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. But before he rested, a thought returned. Not something unfinished, but a small doubt that still refused to be resolved. Why did Felix keep the document in the spoon and not hand it over directly? I'd considered it, of course. Fear, distrust, a need for proof. But something else floated in the air, like a melody you feel you've heard without remembering the lyrics. Poirot stood up and walked over to his display case. There, among objects from other cases, a tie-pin with a hidden sapphire, an undated banknote, a pen that didn't write, lay the spoon. He took it delicately and examined it again. There was nothing new, no additional secret compartment, no hidden engraving, and yet the weight of the piece told him something. That's when he understood. The next day he travelled discreetly to Lyon and requested access to the inventory of the Vanier mansion. Madame Vanier didn't object. Her energy was different, more subdued, almost absent. Aline no longer lived there. Lisette had retired to the countryside. The house was halfway between a mausoleum and a family museum. "What are you looking for, Monsieur Poirot?" Clémence asked upon receiving him. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but maybe I'll recognize it when I see it. It was Jacques, before dying civilly before society, who had said something without realizing it. Nobody used that old set of cutlery anymore. And yet, at the murder dinner, a spoon was placed exactly in Aline's place. It wasn't an oversight. It was a surrender, cryptic, subtle, but deliberate. Poirot examined the entire set. There were 23 spoons, not 24. One had been missing for years. According to records, it was removed due to a supposed defect in its carving. But it wasn't destroyed. That was the spoon that held the secret. And Felix, a meticulous man, did not hide it like a coward, but placed it back on the table, at dinner, in front of the only person who was to inherit it, Aline. The message was clear. Aline had to discover her legacy for herself. No exposure, no battles, just a spoon, a piece from the table of the powerful that now belonged to her. Felix was not just a victim. He was a witness, and also a protector. Poirot left the mansion for the last time without announcing himself. On his way back to the station, he passed an antiques market. He stopped. In a corner, a vendor was selling oddly matched teaspoons. "Anything of interest, monsieur?" the merchant asked. Poirot smiled. "No, thank you. I already have mine." In Brussels that evening he wrote down the final line of the case. "Not all crimes seek punishment. Some seek understanding." And then, as if the mystery had never happened, he plunged back into the perfect order of his routine. He polished his shoes, aligned the gas knobs, placed his exact watch in the centre of the table, and he closed the night with a last look at the silver spoon, as if to remind ourselves that even the most elegant objects can hold the most uncomfortable truths. Chapter 12. Epilogue with Silver Reflection. 3 months passed. Spring, which had brought doubts and unearthings to the Varnier mansion, was succeeded by an indecisive summer. The garden regained its colour. The vines began to cover the walls with a new green, but inside the house hadn't recovered its soul. Madame Varnier had left the residence, moving to a small apartment in Aix-en-Provence, where, according to rumours, she spent her days rereading her late husband's letters and replying to none. Her last instructions were clear. Armand's legacy would not be disputed. Aline would receive a share not as a legitimate heir, but as an act of reparation. The notary Delorme executed the will discreetly. Aline, who had been in Paris taking archival courses, received the news with surprise. "And what does she say?" he asked Delorme, with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. "Nothing, mademoiselle." He just left a written record that he hoped he'd never have to exercise power again. In Brussels, Poirot had returned to his old ways. But the spoon case, as he privately called it, remained with unusual vitality in his thoughts. He had classified it as solved, yes, but not closed. Because some stories don't end with punishment, but with acceptance. And that, the most difficult of victories, cannot be forced by deduction. One morning, he received a handwritten letter. The sender's name was blank, but the delicate, precise handwriting was unmistakable. Mr. Poirot, I feel at peace for the first time in a long time. I know I wasn't brave in his presence, but since then I've learned that courage isn't always manifested in confrontations, but in the decisions you make when no one is watching. I have donated the entire dinnerware set to a museum in Lyon, under the name Claire Le Marchand. I no longer wish to preserve a table stained by silence. I am attaching something that I believe belongs to you. With gratitude, Poirot took a small cloth-wrapped object from the envelope. He carefully unwrapped it. It was another silver spoon, identical to the one he kept, but without a hidden compartment. No history, just form, just reflection. And yet, that was the final piece of the puzzle. He stood up, crossed his office, and placed the new spoon next to the old one. One, a symbol of hidden deception, the other of accepted truth. And in that double reflection, Poirot did not see two utensils. He saw the whole story. Days later, in a discreet café in the Ixelles district, Poirot met with Inspector Giraud, an old acquaintance who, although never a rival to the Belgian, had grown to respect him. "A case without a court again?" the inspector asked, stirring his coffee. "With resignation. Don't you get tired of closing doors that the law never opened?" "Au contraire," said Poirot. "That's precisely what I specialize in. The law is blind, mon ami. But justice sometimes needs small, perfectly calibrated glasses." "And what did you learn this time?" Poirot looked into his cup, as if the bottom offered him a secret answer. That objects don't lie, but those who use them do. That there are crimes committed out of devotion, and truths that die of shame, and that silence, used with precision, can be more lethal than a weapon. Poetic? No, just exactly. That evening back home, Poirot placed the second teaspoon in a wooden box, along with Aline's letter. He locked it. I no longer needed to display it. The case was complete. Not because of the confession, not because of the punishment, but because someone had finally decided to face the forgotten portrait and leave it hanging, not as an accusation, but as a memento. Poirot sat down in his reading chair, and as the clock struck 11, he murmured, almost to himself, "It's not a goodbye, it's a conclusion," and he let silence do what it does best, protect what no longer needs to be said. Final end of Hercule Poirot and the Secret in the Silver Spoon. Chapter 13. Echoes in the Metal. It was a moonless night when Aline briefly returned to the Varnier mansion. She did so alone, unannounced. The gardens, already overgrown, breathed an air of abandonment. The central fountain, which once murmured with clear water, was now a dry basin, filled with leaves and silence. She had come to collect one last box of her belongings, but beyond that, what drove her to cross the threshold was a less tangible need. To close the circle, not with words, but with presence. Upon entering the blue room, she heard the echo of footsteps that were no longer audible. The place still retained that scent of ancient wood and expensive perfume, but without the weight of surveillance. This time there were no eyes measuring gestures or knives cutting the air with silence. Claire's portrait was still there. "Hello, maman," Aline murmured. I didn't expect a response, but something in the stillness of the room seemed to hold a silent acceptance. It was then that he noticed a small object on the sideboard, a dark blue velvet box. He didn't remember seeing it before. Inside was a silver teaspoon, smaller than the others. The handle was slightly curved, with no hidden compartments. It bore no initials, but on the back was an engraved inscription. For Didon, the one who never had a seat at the table. For the one who never had her place at the table. Aline sat down. For the first time in this entire story, tears flowed unchecked. Not from sadness, but from recognition. Someone, she didn't know who, had understood the essential point. That beyond the will, the inheritance, the family scandal, what she had, needed all her life was to be acknowledged. Not as an illegitimate daughter, not as a hidden heir, but as a part of it, as someone who had a right to a place, even if he was late. In Brussels, Poirot was closing his diary when an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside, only a handwritten note. Mr. Poirot, I found the spoon you know where. I'm guessing it was Madame Varnier. She never apologized out loud, but this was the closest she could come. Thanks for everything. Poirot read the note, held it for a moment with 2 fingers, and then placed it between the pages of his casebook. The original spoon, the one with the hidden secret, remained in its display case. But this other one, the last one, was different. It contained no clues, no lies, no hidden documents, just one sentence. Simple, unforgettable. Weeks later, at a private criminology conference in Geneva, Poirot was invited to speak on the psychology of the murderer who is not a criminal. An oxymoron, you might say. He began before an attentive audience. But it isn't. There are those who commit crimes not out of ambition, nor out of rage, but out of fear. Fear of losing order, reputation, legacy. And that fear, mes amis, doesn't produce monsters, but cowardly decisions disguised as duty. A young student raised his hand. And how do you punish a crime like that, Monsieur Poirot? Sometimes you don't punish, he replied. You understand, you reveal, and then you let it go. When he returned home, he found the teaspoon Aline had sent him on his desk. Without ceremony, he placed it next to the other one. Now there were 2 of them. One was talking about crime, the other of redemption, and between them the echo of a story where, for once, justice didn't take the form of a trial, but of a gesture. Poirot poured himself a coffee. He looked at both spoons, and he smiled, because even in the simplest objects one could still hear the human soul, if one knew where and how to look. Chapter 14. The Dinner That Never Took Place. Week later, at an elegant Paris restaurant, Poirot was invited to a private dinner in his honour. It was organised by a small circle of intellectuals and art patrons. People who, in addition to admiring the Belgian detective's impeccable logic, wished to see him in a setting that didn't involve corpses or family scandals. The maitre d' offered him a table on the enclosed terrace, decorated with white lilies and gleaming cutlery. Everything was, as he appreciated, tidy. Monsieur Poirot, this dinner is a tribute to your legacy, said the host, a professor of criminology at the IEH, Sorbonne. A mind like yours should be celebrated for what it is. cultural heritage. Poirot responded with a diplomatic smile and a nod. "You are very nice, sir. But if I must be honest, there is one dinner that still outweighs any tribute." Those present looked at each other curiously. One of them asked, "Are you talking about an unsolved case?" "Not exactly. I'm talking about a dinner that was interrupted by death. Not a violent death, no, a slow death. Of a truth that took too many years to be told." No one replied. They understood that Poirot wasn't playing with metaphors. At that table, Poirot continued, running his finger over the fork lined up in front of him, an unacknowledged heiress sat, unaware that she was the true mistress of the place, and a mother consumed by guilt chose silence as her legacy. The waiters served fennel soup and a crisp white wine. Poirot barely touched the first bite. "And did you manage to right that wrong?" asked a young student sitting to his left. "Not entirely," Poirot replied honestly. "Repair isn't always possible, but revealing, yes. Sometimes telling the truth is the only thing you can do, and that's enough to change the course of a life." There was a respectful silence. "And what happened to the heiress?" "He left," Poirot said gently. "Not with resentment, not with pride. He left like someone who, having found his place, no longer needed to stay." After dinner, Poirot walked alone along the Pont Alexandre III. The night was clear. The river reflected the city lights with an almost theatrical serenity. He stopped by a lamp-post and took a small object from his inside coat pocket, a copy of the Silver Teaspoon. Not the one who hid the document, not the one that symbolized redemption. It was another one, an exact copy, but without history, just a symbol. He gently tossed it into the Seine, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a closing. The spoon sank soundlessly. "There's nothing left to save," he murmured. The next day, in his Brussels apartment, he received a postcard. It was a photo of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Lyon. On the back, in firm handwriting, was a single line. "Now the dishes shine without any secrets. Thank you." Aline Poirot placed it on his desk. Then he took out his notebook, opened it to the final page of the case, and added one more line, the last. "Case closed not for lack of culprits, but for an abundance of understanding." And with that, he closed the notebook. Not forever, of course, but yes, for this case, because, as he well knew, mysteries never end. They just change form. And the next one, perhaps, was already on the way. Chapter 15. The Last Traces of Deception. The story of the silver spoon had already left the conversation circles. The press never touched it. The Lion newspapers, accustomed to more immediate scandals, filed the case with a brief note about a tragic family conflict that ended without any major charges. The Varnier name, carefully protected by generations of prestige, survived with barely a visible scratch. But not everyone had let go of the thread. In a small office in Lyon, Inspector Girard, a man with a straight moustache and rigid morals, was leafing through the case file again. Jacques' confession was there, signed and sealed. Poirot's letter had been courteous, definitive, and yet something about the case still seemed incomplete. He had interviewed Jacques briefly before his transfer. The old butler, his voice weary, didn't beg for mercy. He didn't defend himself. But he did let out a sentence that was now buzzing in the inspector's head. "I just obeyed. I didn't hit him with the intention they say I did. I didn't know what it would do, until it was too late." Girard closed the folder in annoyance. That word, "I obeyed," hadn't left him alone. Hundreds of miles away in Brussels, Poirot had already accepted the decision. Jacques wasn't the only one responsible, but he was the only one willing to pay. Madame Varnier, though not a criminal according to the legal code, had moved the chess pieces until checkmate was achieved. Her intelligence was of a different kind, emotional, subtle. She didn't kill, but she killed the will of the one who would do it for her. And that kind of guilt was the most invisible of all. Poirot had learned over his long career that not all truths are revealed by evidence. Some are recognized by instinct, by rhythm, by the irregular melody that remains when everything else seems harmonious. So when he received an unexpected invitation to a private exhibition at the Varnier Foundation, a cultural event on the French tradition of silver objects, he didn't hesitate to attend. The foundation was housed in a new gallery, built with discreet and silent funds, bearing the name of Madame Geneviève Varnier as honorary president. Aline didn't appear anywhere in the directory. Poirot, greeted with a professional bow, scanned the aisles with eyes that sought not art, but hidden history. The display cases were filled with antique cutlery, candlesticks, trays and teapots, and at the back, in a special section, an installation entitled "Incomplete Service, the Empty Place." There, on black velvet, a single teaspoon rested under a white spotlight. It was identical to the ones in the case. But this one had no compartment, no inscription. Only a small label read, "Sometimes the most important place at the table is the one no one claimed." Poirot smiled with a mixture of respect and sadness. The gesture was Aline's, without a doubt, not Madame Varnier's, who would have preferred to ignore the emptiness. That installation wasn't a tribute, it was a reminder. And he understood that, without trial or press, the story had indeed been told. Not in words, in symbols. When he left the gallery, already at night, Poirot walked through the quiet streets of Lyon until he reached the old Saint-Joseph orphanage. He hadn't expected to go in. He just wanted to see it once more. The gate was still rusty. The cornerstone was intact. An entire generation had passed by without knowing that a daughter of magnates had slept among its narrow beds. There, Claire Le Marchand had begun her life as a shadow. And now, in a discreet corner of history, her name was, finally, beginning to carry its own weight. Poirot took a small notebook out of his pocket and wrote with his fountain pen. There is no crime without a trace. Sometimes the most invisible of them is the one that lasts. He closed the notebook, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like there was nothing left to learn. Just remember. That night, at his hotel, a letter was waiting for him on the table, unstamped, unsigned. It just said, "Thank you for not seeking punishment. Thank you for seeking the truth." Poirot put it away without reading it twice, because some things, like certain spoons, don't need to be proven, just understood. Chapter 16. The Legacy That Was Not Written. The train to Marseille rolled gently past the lavender fields and vineyards that undulated under the late summer sky. Seated by the window, Hercule Poirot carried a small suitcase, his round-handled walking stick, and an invitation written in a steady feminine hand. It came from Aix-en-Provence. Madame Varnier requested a visit from him. The letter contained no plea, no apology, no embellishment, just a single sentence. There are things that can't be said in front of witnesses. If you are who I think you are, you'll know why I'm inviting you. G.V. Poirot had seen many masks throughout his career. The mask of the victim, the martyr, the weeping traitor. But Madame Varnier's was of a different kind. It was the mask of duty assumed as a shield, and sometimes, though rarely, even he would agree to a conversation without a tape recorder or notebook. The residence in Aix was modest, almost monastic. A garden of aromatic plants, white wooden shutters, and an oxidized bronze sculpture depicting a faceless woman. The door was opened by Geneviève Varnier herself, aging gracefully. She wore a pearly grey dress and a dark scarf around her neck. Her white hair was neatly tied back. "Thank you for coming," he said, and said nothing more. Poirot bowed his head and entered the small drawing-room. "Have you had peace, madame?" "I don't believe in peace," she replied. "I believe in stability. It's the most one can hope for when one has lived in control." They both sat down at a wooden table without a tablecloth. Tea had already been served. Poirot didn't interrupt her. He knew he hadn't been called to give advice, but to hear a confession that couldn't be written down. "I don't want anything published, nor do I want the case reopened. What happened, happened. You understood. That's why you're here. I didn't judge him, madam. I just saw him." She nodded gravely. "Aline has moved on. I know she'll never fully forgive me, but at least I'm not holding her back any more. Lisette writes to me every week, and that's more than I deserve. But there's something you don't know." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Claire wasn't a casual fling. Armand loved her deeply. He knew her before he met me. When he learned he was going to be a father, he wanted to do the right thing. But he was also ambitious, and his family, his name, didn't allow for mistakes. So he gave up on love and chose legacy. He chose me, for position, for structure. And you accepted it. No," he said dryly. "I bought it. I bought his repentance, with silence, with a house, with obedience. Claire was the memory that never left. And when she died, I thought it was all over. But it didn't end," whispered Poirot. Madame Varnier smiled bitterly. "No, sir, because the past doesn't disappear. It just hides in drawers. Or in spoons. They were silent for a few seconds. Then she slowly stood up, walked over to a low display case, and took out an envelope sealed with antique wax. "This is the last will Armand wrote. He never registered it. He never officially signed it. But he asked me to keep it. And if I ever found the courage to give it to someone who deserved it." Poirot extended his hand gently. "Do you want it to be made public?" "No," she said firmly. "I want Aline to decide. I no longer have the right to speak for anyone." Poirot took the envelope, examined it without opening it, and placed it inside his jacket. Then he stood up. "Madam, not all crimes are punishable. but all silence has a price. You've begun to pay it." She looked into his eyes. "Do you think that's enough?" Poirot tilted his head. "For the world, perhaps not. For your conscience, only you know." Days later, in a café in Paris's Latin Quarter, Aline received the envelope in person. There was no letter, no note, just the unmistakable stamp of the Varnier name. She didn't open it at the time. He simply held it in his hands, as if it weighed more than a will, as if she carried within her not only a legacy, but a childhood, a lost mother, and a name she could finally pronounce without fear. Claire Le Marchand. In his Brussels apartment, Poirot made one last note in his notebook. The crime was no longer the murder, but the silence that led to it, and justice wasn't brought by the law, but by the most humane act of all, surrendering control. Then he closed the notebook. Not forever, of course, but for now, yes. Chapter 17. The Voice in the Unsent Letter. Days after receiving the unregistered will, Aline strolled through the Luxembourg Gardens, the envelope still sealed in her purse. She hadn't opened it. Not because she feared its contents, but because she understood that doing so was an irreversible act. Once those words were read, the veil between what was and what might have been would be torn, and she could no longer pretend that the past was just someone else's history. She walked among chestnut trees and honeysuckle, watching children playing with sailboats in the fountains. There, amidst innocent laughter, the world seemed simpler. And yet, deep inside, something kept beating with a hidden rhythm. On a nearby bench, he opened his notebook. He began to write without thinking, without planning. He just let the ink flow, as if his soul needed to escape through the tip of the pen. To you, Claire, my unknown mother, my silenced truth. Today, finally, I name you without fear. I grew up believing family trees were straight lines, but you were the curve the world insisted on erasing. I was taught to respect silences as if they were virtues. I was told that some things shouldn't be asked, and I obediently didn't ask them. But now I know you didn't abandon me, that you were torn from the story, that you were drawn as a shadow when you were light. Today, I have your portrait hanging in my living room, and not as a relic, but as a mirror. Today, I hold in my hands a will that names you unambiguously, not out of pity, not out of correctness, but out of truth. And I still don't know if I want to open it, because you've already given me what I needed, your name, and that's enough for me. He signed simply as a line. He put the sheet of paper in the envelope, and in doing so, he decided not to send it to anyone. Not because it wasn't worth reading, but because he knew there were other ways to communicate, the essentials. That night in her Parisian apartment, she finally broke the seal and unfolded the original will. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She read each word with the serenity of someone who no longer needs proof. At the end of the document, a sentence written in lighter ink and with a hand that was more shaky than the rest made her stop. And if this letter ever reaches you, my daughter, know that my cowardice was out of fear, not lack of love. I always knew you had a right to your place. Forgive me for not having given it to you in life. Aline closed the document. Then she lit a candle, and, in a slow, deliberate act, burned the sheet of paper. Not out of contempt, but out of liberation. The fire wasn't a punishment. It was a ritual. In Brussels, Poirot received a postcard with no return address. Just a picture. Claire's portrait, hanging on a light-coloured wall. Below, in small letters, the inscription, "I don't need your will any more. She gave me everything." Poirot placed it among his most precious objects, right next to his magnifying glass and the empty spoon. That night, as he turned off the light in his living room, he thought that not all cases end with an arrest or a sentence. Some end up with a daughter, who finally allows herself to love the one who brought her into the world. Even if that love was never spoken. Final chapter. The spoon in its place. A year after the incident, a new wing was opened in an exhibition hall at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, the Objects of Silence. The collection was dedicated to everyday artifacts that, beyond their function, had hidden human stories. Among clocks containing undelivered letters, brooches with secret compartments, and portraits painted over previous portraits, one object stood out for its simplicity and lack of ornamentation. Silver spoon, no registration, no compartment, just a title. The place that was denied, and then recognized. No one would have known its exact story if it weren't for the man who had rescued it from narrative oblivion. Hercule Poirot, a special guest at the opening, didn't take pride of place. He preferred to stand on the sidelines, observing the flow of people, curious glances and vague interpretations. And he liked that, because mystery, like truth, was most powerful when it didn't need to be explained. That same afternoon, Poirot was approached by a young reporter from the World, curious about the legend behind the central object of the exhibition. "Monsieur Poirot, it is said that you solved the spoon case," he said with a mixture of respect and mischief. "Was it really a crime?" Poirot tilted his head with a slight smile. "Ah, mademoiselle, that depends on how you define crime. Is murder the only thing punishable? Or is denying someone's identity for the sake of convenience also punishable? And who was the culprit? There were many guilty parties, as in every good tragedy. But redemption, that's what allows us to move forward." The young woman remained silent for a few seconds. "And what's so special about that spoon?" Poirot replied without looking at the object. "Nothing, except that she was, for a moment, the only bearer of truth in a house full of lies." That evening, Poirot returned to his apartment. On his desk, he still kept the leather notebook where he recorded his private thoughts. He opened it to the last page of the case. He added one more line. It wasn't the spoon that solved the crime, but the absence of its twin. As in every good story, what's missing reveals more than what's there. He closed the notebook. He crossed the apartment, poured himself a cup of herbal tea, and sat down in front of the open window. The lights of Brussels flickered like distant memories. From the mantelpiece, two objects stared back at him. The original teaspoon, that silent witness to the crime, and an identical copy sent later by Aline. Together, they were not evidence, they were promises. One, not to be forgotten. The other, not to repeat. Weeks later, he received a letter. There was no return address, but the strokes were familiar. Mr. Poirot, I've started a family archive, not out of vanity, but out of justice. Claire is no longer a name erased. I've used part of my inheritance to create scholarships for young orphans. I'm giving them a table to sit at. Thank you for seeing in the spoon what no one wanted to look at. With gratitude, Aline. Poirot put the letter in the same drawer where others of equal warmth, but less clarity, lay, because this story, finally, did have a closure. Not everyone has it. In his last note on the case, he wrote, "It wasn't a murder I solved, it was a lineage. I didn't stop a crime. I restored a place, and justice, my friends, isn't always served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's served on a table, with a single teaspoon."